idea it was going to be
Yeah.
this.
When she asked, I was like, I'm bringing all the equipment, so.
Well, yeah, I was just like, oh, you might find this interesting. You know, I'm just inviting everyone. You might find it interesting. And then the next thing I do.
I'll hit one more button. Sorry.
Yes, but we appreciate it.
Testing.
Hi. Hi. Can you say something? I want to see if she can hear you.
Okay, just
testing.
I can hear you. Okay, you can hear that? Great.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing.
You can just get set up over there.
Hey.
Jacob, Dr. Carlson, Jacob.
Nice to meet you.
So we've got several people on Zoom now, and more people should come walking in. There's a contingent that has a 9 o'clock class on the other side of campus, so they're normally a little bit late.
Well, would it make sense to sort of have a conversation for 5 minutes?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Yes, I knew my meeting is started. Let's. Hey, morning. How are you?
Hi.
Luke's on Zoom. So, Charlie, let's give it another couple minutes, but yeah, how are you guys doing, you know, running toward the end of the semester?
Good.
Good. Were you able to register? Has your registration, freshman registration?
Yeah, we had it this morning.
Yeah, oh, this morning, how'd it go?
Pretty good. I got 3 of the 6 that I wanted.
Okay, that's not
Better
too
than
bad.
last time.
Yeah. All right, I see Olivia and all right, we've now got quite a large crew on Zoom.
I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh! What?
Oh.
It's a carpenter bee. Здравствуйте. Это не опасные пчелы, это приятные, дружелюбные пчелы. These are friendly bees. They don't sting. So we do have carpenter bees here. I don't know if you know carpenter bees. They're like bumblebees. They're not dangerous. They are big, but they're not dangerous. So let's get 1, 2, 3. Ellen hasn't. We've got a bunch of people on Zoom, so say hi to the Zoom crew. All right. Let's go ahead and maybe get started. You know, we can have a sort of a chatting for a couple minutes, and maybe a couple more people will roll in, and we'll see Pierce and Ellen were both.
Pierce is walking up right
Oh,
now.
Pierce is walking up right now? All right, well, we'll give him. There he is. Is he also in your classes? All right.
Some of my classes.
I think he's a resident of South, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, once Pierce gets here, we'll go ahead and get started. Hey,
Hello.
hey.
Hello again.
Go ahead and grab a seat over there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a large contingent on Zoom. Zoom people, if you have, let me know if you're having trouble hearing. And when we get to the Q&A section, if you have questions, just use the raise hand function or shout out, and I'll, let you ask your question. Or you can, if you can't talk, put it in the chat, and I will read your question for you. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Brian Carlson here to Wake Forest. Brian Carlson is a research professor of Indo-Pacific Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College, where he is part of the China Land Power Studies Center at the Strategic Studies Institute. His research focuses primarily on the China-Russia relationship. Previously, he was head of the Global Security Team at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich, Switzerland. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you. And also, we know each other from intensive language training together in Moscow. So if you have questions about that, I mean, the situation has changed a lot, but...
That was 3 or 4 years ago.
Only 3 or 4 years ago. Anyway, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you here, and I think you're going to give us sort of a short talk about the situation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you. Since we have a small group, should we do a round of introductions?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
I'm Jacob Woodman. I'm a freshman here. Yeah. I don't know what else.
Why are you taking this class?
I'm doing it for the divisional that I
Yeah,
had.
you have to. All right, Olivia.
My name is Olivia Ford. I'm also a freshman, and I'm taking Russian language, so I thought this FYS would pair nicely with taking Russian.
My name's Emerson. I'm also a freshman, and same reason. Yes.
Yeah.
Russian language is good, and I like this class.
Yeah. Pierce.
My name is Pierce, and I'm taking this class because I thought it was interesting, just kind of the topic, and I also wanted to learn more about the Russian culture.
Charlie.
I'm Charlie, and I'm taking this class because I'm very interested in politics and current events, and I think Russia is probably the most interesting topic right now.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Brian Calhoun, Department of Education, interested in politics and
All right.
geopolitics as well.
And then from the Zoom room, Lizzie.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm also a freshman and taking this class because it's required, but also it's interesting.
Will M. Will Morford, are you there? We'll circle back to Will. Jake.
Hey, I'm taking this because I'm in a Russian class and I wanted to learn more about the culture while I'm learning the language.
Awesome. Luke.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a freshman. I'll stay in this class just because it feels divisional and it looks really interesting.
Awesome. Angelina.
Hi, I'm Angelina. I'm taking this class because it feels the divisional and also my mom is Russian.
Yeah. Will Ginsburg.
Hi, my name's Will, and I'm taking this class because it's divisional and my family's Ukrainian, so I'm interested.
Yep. Gigi.
Hi, I'm Gigi. My family is also Ukrainian, and I thought this class sounded super interesting.
Celia.
Hi, I'm Celia, and I'm a freshman, and I'm taking this class because it's very interesting.
Awesome. Thanks. Will Morford, are you there? Oh, hey, Ellen. We're doing a quick round of introductions. You want to say hi to everyone?
Hi there. I'm Ellen. I'm sorry I'm late.
No problem. And people are saying why they're taking this class.
I I like Russian. I learned it a tiny bit in high school. Yeah, and I wanted to learn more about the history, which I hadn't learned.
All right. Awesome, great. I think that's everyone. Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much again for
I'm
the
gonna scoot closer so they can hear
invitation.
you.
Okay. I think this is the fourth time I've given a talk.
I think so,
The
yeah.
first couple of times were online, and then I came here a year ago, and it's nice to be back in person again. And each time I've talked about the China-Russia relationship and especially the impact of the war in Ukraine. I think maybe the first talk might have been just before the start, but the last two for sure have been since the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine in February of 2022. And so I'm going to sort of talk about that a little bit generally and then focus on a couple of major developments in the last year. First of all, the deepening of the Russia-North Korea relationship, which has been really interesting and has an impact on China. And then also the election of Trump and his efforts to end the war and what that means for the China-Russia relationship as well. So China and Russia have gotten steadily closer over 30 plus years now. Even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were starting to improve their relationship. And I would say they've gotten especially close since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and started an insurgency in the eastern part of Ukraine. So that was the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and Russia was isolated, and so they turned to China at that point. And they've gotten closer together in the years since then. And we really saw that at the beginning of February 2022, just before the invasion, when Putin went to Beijing for the Olympics. And while he was there, he and Xi Jinping had a meeting, and they made a joint declaration in which they said that the friendship between China and Russia had no limits, and there were no forbidden zones of cooperation. And that was quite a statement. And then less than 3 weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So it kind of gave people the impression that these two authoritarian powers were colluding together, trying to challenge the United States and challenge the international order, and that China might have been supportive of what Russia was doing. And in reality, it's not clear that China knew exactly what Russia was going to do. There are indications that Putin might not have fully shared his plans at that point for a full-scale invasion. China probably expected he was going to do something, but they may not have realized that he was going to mount this full-scale invasion with the effort of toppling the government in Ukraine and taking over most or all of the country. And so there were some disadvantages to this for China. It does, in some ways, hurts their international reputation, because it looks like they're supporting this authoritarian country that's engaged in aggression against Ukraine. And so it had the potential to hurt some of China's economic ties around the world. And there was also a chance that by the United States working together with its allies and partners to counter Russia, that this could bring greater unity among the United States and its allies for also countering China. So there were certain downsides to China, but throughout the more than 3 years now since the war began, China has made very clear that it continues to really value this partnership with Russia. And I would say the main reason for that is that China sees that the US-China rivalry is really intensifying. And they think that's going to be their major challenge for decades to come. And so when they're in competition with the United States, they need friends. And they don't really have any better friend than Russia. Russia is not what it used to be in terms of being a superpower as the Soviet Union, but it's still a powerful country, has a large nuclear arsenal, huge territory, and the ability to project power in Europe, the Middle East, and to some extent in Asia. So having a powerful country like Russia as a friend that joins with China in opposing the United States and trying to change the international order to weaken the influence of the United States and its allies is valuable for China. And so they have made clear repeatedly that they want to preserve this partnership, and they're not going to abandon Russia, they're not going to condemn Russia for what it's doing. Now, despite what they said about no limits, there are certain limits on the support that China has provided Russia. So, for example, China has not provided weapons to Russia or other forms of direct lethal assistance. And that's a red line that the United States and its allies drew for China and said, if you do that, there are going to be serious consequences in terms of sanctions on Chinese companies and other penalties for the Chinese economy. So China has refrained from doing that. But China has supported Russia in a number of ways. They've supported Russia rhetorically and diplomatically. They've made statements saying that the United States and the West are to blame for the war in Ukraine because they supposedly didn't respect Russia's legitimate security interests, especially by expanding NATO into Eastern Europe and talking about even bringing Ukraine into NATO. And China has also increased its purchases of Russian oil and gas, which has been really helpful for Russia because Russia has lost markets for its energy in Europe and the West, and this helps them to earn a lot of money from those sales, which has helped to finance the war. And probably most importantly, China, although it hasn't provided weapons to Russia, it has provided a lot of what are called dual-use goods. So these goods have both civilian and military applications. And so Russia has made use of some of those in the war in Ukraine and for rebuilding its defense industry. So things like computer chips or nitrocellulose, which is a chemical compound that goes into producing certain kinds of weapons, and even providing Russia with big earth movers and excavators that have helped them to dig trenches along the front lines in Ukraine. So there have been a number of dual-use goods like that that have had a big impact. So China has, I would say, China has done everything it possibly can to help Russia since the war began without crossing the line that would really cause serious problems for them in relations with the United States and Europe. China's economy remains very much intertwined with the U.S. economy and with economies in Europe, and so they would have a lot to lose from breakdown of economic relations. We see that now in their reaction to this tariff war. They're very concerned about the impact of that. But China has wanted not only to preserve those economic ties, but it also wants to strengthen economic ties, especially with Europe, and make Europe more dependent on China, so that Europe won't be so willing to join with the United States in countering China. And so the war creates complications for China in that respect, because it looks like they're supporting Russia in engaging in aggression in Europe, and that makes European countries less willing to cooperate with China and more willing to look for ways to counter China. And so that's a cost to China of this war. So there are certain pros and cons for China. On the con side, these economic ties are threatened. Their international reputation could be damaged. But there are certain benefits. The war potentially distracts the United States, makes it harder to focus on countering China. And it also makes Russia more dependent on China, which could be useful for China. So again, there are certain steps China has taken that have fallen short of what Russia might have hoped for. China has not provided direct weapons to Russia, and China has also said on a couple of occasions that it was opposed to Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine or threatening to use them. It made public statements like that, and reportedly when Xi Jinping went to Moscow and met with Putin, he told him that privately as well, that China did not want to see the use of nuclear weapons. But for the most part, China has really tried to maintain that partnership. And so now we're in a situation where Trump is trying to put an end to the war, and China has expressed efforts for diplomatic pathways to bringing an end to the war. So that's sort of the broad overview of the China-Russia relationship since the war started. And as I said, I'd like to focus on first on the Russia-North Korea relationship, and then on prospects for possibly bringing this war to an end. So Russia and North Korea have gotten a lot closer since the war began, and this has gone a lot farther than most people expected. Right after the war began, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, made very clear that he was fully supportive of Russia. When votes came up in the United Nations, North Korea always voted in favor of Russia's position. And that's something that even China wouldn't do. China would always abstain on those votes. But North Korea said, yes, we fully support Russia's actions in Ukraine. And North Korea was in a situation where they've been really isolated for a while. Kim Jong-un responded to Donald Trump's attempts at diplomacy during his first term, and those didn't lead anywhere. They ended in failure. And North Korea felt more and more dependent on China, but China was irritated in a lot of ways by North Korea's behavior. So North Korea was looking for a way to kind of break out of its isolation and not be so dependent on China. And so it saw an opportunity to reach out to Russia. And this is something that we've seen throughout the history of North Korea, even going back into the 50s and 60s. They always thought that they could kind of play China and the Soviet Union against each other and make them compete for North Korea's favor. And so in this way they could have a little bit more room for maneuver. And so this is kind of a revival of that tactic. North Korea playing China and Russia against each other. So North Korea took some really amazing steps in support of Russia. It provided ammunition, artillery shells, and missiles for the war. And then starting in October of last year, it actually sent troops, about 12,000 North Korean soldiers reportedly. And I don't think anyone saw this coming. This was a real surprise. And the way that Russia has used those North Korean troops is that there's a region in Russia called Kursk that Ukraine made an incursion into last August. Ukraine actually took the war to Russia and occupied a sizable swath of this Kursk region. The idea was that when the war came to an end, Ukraine would have a bargaining chip. It could say, well, we will give you back this territory that we have occupied in Russia in exchange for territorial concessions in Ukraine. But Russia employed the North Korean troops in the Kursk region. And the North Korean troops suffered very heavy casualties. And there are reports that a lot of these, maybe even all of the North Korean troops, didn't really understand what they were doing. When they got this assignment, that they may not have understood they were being sent to actually fight on the front line. So this is a shocking development, and Russia now has succeeded in pushing Ukraine mostly out of the Kursk region. So the North Korean soldiers have had an impact there. And so what has North Korea gotten in return for this? It's gotten much needed money and food and fuel and other supplies. And then there's also speculation that North Korea might have also gotten certain forms of military assistance from Russia. So they had two failed attempts to launch a military satellite, and then suddenly they had a successful launch. And so South Korean intelligence and other sources think that they might have gotten Russia's help with that. And they've also had two recent launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Again, there's a lot of speculation that they might have gotten Russia's support and assistance with that. And so all of this, in certain ways, is a concern for China for a number of reasons. First of all, it adds to the impression that has been growing for a couple of years that there's not just the China-Russia relationship that poses problems for the United States and the West, but even a broader axis that includes China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They engage in certain forms of cooperation with the common goal of weakening the power of the United States and changing the international order more in their favor. And so China doesn't really like having that impression out there. They don't really want to be seen as the leader of this axis because, again, it potentially could cause them to have problems in their economic relations with other countries, and it could cause other countries to become more concerned about China's ambitions and do more to try to counter it. So China has tried to dispel the notion that there is this axis, but when you see China supporting Russia and North Korea supporting Russia, it does add to this impression of this authoritarian axis. There's also, for China, the concern that Russia, by becoming more supportive of North Korea, could embolden North Korea, and there are signs of that happening. Kim Jong-un has become a lot more belligerent in his rhetoric. He's said that the aim is no longer to peacefully reunite with South Korea, but actually to conquer South Korea and take it over. A year or so ago, there was shelling of South Korean islands, and so a lot of belligerent rhetoric and actions that has created more instability in that region. And that is worrying for China in a number of ways because, first of all, if China is by far the most influential country over the North Korean regime, but now if Russia becomes more influential and China loses some of its influence, there's a chance that North Korea could become emboldened to take aggressive action, and China would have less ability to control the situation. So that's a concern. There's also a concern that North Korea becoming more belligerent could cause the United States and its allies in the region to work more closely together. And we already see this happening to some extent. So in the final year of Biden's presidency, he brought together Japan and South Korea to work together in a trilateral alliance with the United States. And this is something that has always been very difficult to do, to get Japan and South Korea to cooperate, because there's a history of Japanese occupation and colonization of South Korea and bad treatment of South Korean people, including sex slavery for South Korean women. And so you have these historical memories of Japanese aggression in South Korea, and so it's been hard to get them to work together. But now they are working more closely together because they're concerned about China. And Russia's war in Ukraine and now the close Russia-North Korea relationship are just making them more and more concerned. So from China's standpoint, it's not good to see the United States working more and more closely with allies like South Korea and Japan, because they're concerned that they're the target of that. They're also concerned that South Korea and Japan could decide that North Korea is moving ahead with its nuclear program. It has done a number of nuclear tests and missile tests, and at some point South Korea and Japan could say, well, we're going to build our own nuclear weapons. Right now they depend on the US nuclear arsenal. The United States promises to use its nuclear arsenal to protect them, but they could conclude at some point that they need their own nuclear weapons. And so that wouldn't be good from China's standpoint. So for all these reasons, China is somewhat concerned about this closer Russia-North Korea relationship, but at the same time, they haven't done much to try to put a stop to it. So that, to me, indicates that although there are certain costs to China of this relationship, nevertheless, they see an overall benefit in maintaining close relations with Russia and North Korea. And so, for example, if I mentioned that China hasn't directly provided weapons to Russia, but North Korea has. So from China's standpoint, if North Korea provides Russia with weapons, maybe that takes pressure off China to provide Russia with weapons. And so they think that this close relationship between Russia and North Korea strengthens both of those countries, which is good from their perspective. I talked about why China values the relationship with Russia. North Korea remains valuable for China because for them it's a buffer. There are a lot of U.S. forces in South Korea. North Korea is a buffer between those U.S. forces and Chinese territory. And so China wants to preserve the existence of the North Korean regime. So I would argue that despite the problems and concerns and risks for China of the growing Russia-North Korea relationship, overall they find it tolerable. They think that the benefits outweigh the risks, and if it ever reached a point that was really damaging to them, they probably believe that they could step in and control it somehow. As I mentioned, Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China, and North Korea is very dependent on China. So in an extreme case, China presumably would have enough influence to step in and say, we want to put some limits on this relationship. They haven't done that so far, so that suggests to me that overall they're okay with the way things are going. Now, in terms of Donald Trump's efforts to end this war, he, of course, campaigned on this. He said he could end the war in 24 hours, which he has now acknowledged was an exaggeration. He's finding it very difficult to get to the end of the war. But his administration has made very clear that one of their purposes in trying to end the war is to drive a wedge between Russia and China, or at least try to get Russia to pull back a little bit from going all in on this relationship with China. So, for example, J.D. Vance said in an interview with the Wall Street Journal that he thought it was not in Russia's interest to become the junior partner of China, and that Russia might have an interest in looking for ways to improve relations with the West and pull away from this situation in which they become more and more dependent on China. And Keith Kellogg, who is the president's representative for Ukraine, said a couple of months ago that the United States would try to put pressure on Russia to pull back from its relationships with China, North Korea, and Iran. And so that's all part of this effort. And so I would say, first of all, that it's going to be very hard to get a settlement to this war. And we've already seen this in the recent developments. So the Trump administration began by putting pressure on Ukraine to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, which Ukraine did agree to. And then the effort was to try to get Russia to agree to it as well, and that is not proven to be possible. Putin hasn't agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. He did reach some more limited agreements on a ceasefire on strikes on energy infrastructure by both sides, and then there was also a deal on the Black Sea to try to limit attacks on Black Sea shipping. But he has not been willing to agree to a full 30-day ceasefire, let alone an end to the war. And this makes sense because from his perspective, he's in a pretty good position. The Russian forces have slowly been moving the line in Ukraine. They're very slowly capturing more territory. They have largely succeeded in pushing Ukrainian forces out of Russian territory in Kursk. And he probably thinks that he just has the overall advantage, certainly in terms of manpower. The population of Russia is much bigger than that of Ukraine. He has a larger population to draw upon for manpower. And he probably believes that if he can keep up the pressure on Ukraine, eventually the West will get tired of providing money and weapons to Ukraine and will just be desperate for a deal. And so far he hasn't responded very much to this, to Trump's efforts to bring an end to the war. And now we see Trump getting upset about this. So Putin made a statement a few days ago saying, maybe the UN could go in and set up a force in Ukraine and could supervise new elections so that we could get a new leadership in Ukraine. And so essentially he doesn't like Zelensky. He wants the Zelensky regime to be toppled, and he wants a more Russia-friendly regime in Ukraine. And so Trump got very angry about these comments and said, if I decide that it's Russia that's blocking an end to this war, then there are lots of things that we can do to punish Russia. Is that a Carpenter beat?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
It's a big one.
Yeah, they're huge. They look scary, but they're completely harmless.
Okay, well that's good. So Trump has said that if he concludes that it's Russia that's the obstacle to putting an end to this war, there are certain things he can do to punish Russia. And one thing he mentioned was that the United States could put big tariffs. Well, he actually said any country that buys Russian oil would not be able to do business with the United States. And I mean, if something like that would occur, that would be stunning, because China and India and other countries still buy a lot of Russian oil, and China, especially, other countries as well, have big economic relations with the United States. So if you take him literally, China would have to stop buying Russian oil or stop doing business with the United States. Whether such sweeping penalties would be actually implemented is doubtful, but he is threatening to use that as a weapon. There have already been major sanctions imposed on Russia that haven't really changed Russia's behavior, and Russia has been largely successful in keeping its economy going, keeping its defense production going, although we do see growing strains in the Russian economy, high inflation and so forth. But this would really, really hurt the Russian economy if they were really largely unable to sell oil on international markets. That would cut off the major source of funding that's funding this war. And so we'll see what Trump does with that. So all of those, I think, are reasons why there are real obstacles to ending this war. So I mentioned that one goal of the Trump administration is to try to use this to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And so I'll just lay out a couple of scenarios for you. One in which the war ends and this effort to put some distance between Russia and China is successful. And then another scenario, which I consider more likely, which is that even if the war ends, the Russia-China relationship will remain pretty strong. So in the first scenario, for people who are looking for information that could suggest that an end to the war and an improvement of U.S.-Russia relations could put some distance between Russia and China, there are certain indicators out there that you can look at. So several weeks ago, when Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with the Russian delegation in Saudi Arabia, Rubio said after the meeting that we discussed possibilities for working together with the Russians on major economic projects. And so if the war would mean, if an end to the war would mean the removal of most or all sanctions on Russia and a rebuilding of Russia's economic ties with the West and major cooperation between the United States and Russia on economic projects, that would reduce Russia's dependence on China. So that alone could weaken the relationship, because right now, as I mentioned, Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China, which gives China a lot of influence over Russia. So ending Russia's economic isolation could reduce that factor a little bit. More specifically, Putin mentioned in a recent television interview with Russian television that he said, okay, the United States and Ukraine are talking about a deal in which the United States would control the mining of rare earth minerals in Ukraine. These rare earth minerals are used in a lot of high technology products, smartphones, computers, iPads, so forth. And so they've become really important in the current international economy. And Putin said, okay, yes, Ukraine has some of these rare earth minerals, but Russia has a lot more. So he held out this possibility that the United States can be involved in the mining of rare earth minerals in Russia. And even the rare earths in Ukraine are in or near the territory that Russia occupies. So even that would require Russia's cooperation. And one interesting thing about this is that right now China has dominance in the international market for rare earths. And they have, in certain ways, used this to penalize other countries that have opposed them. So they've used this against Japan when there was a dispute in the East China Sea several years ago. They restricted the export of rare earth minerals to Japan. Japan, of course, makes a lot of high-tech products. And China has already announced some restrictions on the export of these rare earths to the United States as part of the ongoing trade war. And so if there would be a major deal between the United States and Russia to mine rare earth minerals, that could undercut this source of leverage that China has. So China might not be happy about that. And then just generally, historically, whenever there have been periods when it looked like the United States and Russia were trying to get closer together, China has been concerned about that. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, initially Boris Yeltsin, the president of the new Russian Federation, was trying to integrate Russia into the West. And China was worried about that because Russia seemed to be ignoring or turning its back on China. Within a few years, it became clear that Russia was not going to join the West and not going to turn away from China. And then there were other periods after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. There was a honeymoon in U.S.-Russia relations for a while. China was concerned about that. And then at the beginning of the Obama administration, Obama tried a reset with Russia. And again, there were indications that China was concerned. So every time there is a possibility of an improved U.S.-Russia relationship, China is concerned, but president after president has failed to improve this relationship. And so I'm very skeptical of the prospects for that now. And so those are some indications. And one other very important thing. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago in which the reporter had gotten hold of a think tank report produced by a Russian think tank for the Kremlin. And this report was suggesting an approach that Russia might take in its negotiations with Trump. And one thing they suggested was that Russia could offer to cut off cooperation with China on highly sensitive defense technologies. And if this would happen, that would be a major development because defense cooperation between Russia and China has been one of the major parts of their relationship. Russia has been the number one supplier, number one foreign supplier of weapons to China in the last 35 years. And those weapons have gone a long way to helping China to build up its military forces. And there are some areas in which Russia still has some technology that could really benefit China. So right now, one problem China has is that their submarines are very noisy. So it's very easy for the U.S. Navy to track them. Russia has submarine quieting technology that China is probably interested in. China wants to make its submarines more quiet, which could really increase the challenges for the U.S. military in countering China. And then there are other areas where they could work together too, like hypersonic weapons, undersea warfare capability, and others. So if Russia would really offer to cut off those ties and that cooperation, that would be a major development. Now again, I'm very skeptical about any of this happening. And so this leads me to my second scenario, one in which the war does come to an end, but the China-Russia relationship remains strong. And I think there are several reasons for this. I think first of all, Russia knows that regardless of the state of its relations with the United States, it can't afford to have a bad relationship with China. The two countries share a long border, and the Russian Far East is very underpopulated, underdeveloped. I think at the last count, the Russian Far East had 6 million people, something like that. Right across the border, China's Heilongjiang province has tens of millions of people. So there's a huge imbalance in the population of the two sides. So Russia knows that that territory is potentially vulnerable, and if their relations with China would go sour, sometime in the future, China might be in a position to actually seize that territory, or at least gain such influence over it that they de facto control it. So Russia knows that it has to be very concerned about that situation because the balance of power is tipping. China is becoming more powerful. Russia is stagnant or declining. Also, so Russia definitely needs China, but I think for the time being, China also recognizes that it needs Russia's support for reasons I mentioned, that China knows it's going into this period of rivalry with the United States, and it needs to have a powerful country like Russia on its side. So both countries, for the time being, have a real incentive to maintain this relationship. And indeed, we've seen phone calls between Putin and Xi Jinping at least twice in the last couple of months. Once right around the time Trump was inaugurated, and then another time right around the time that Trump had a long telephone call with Putin. So they continue to signal that this relationship is important to them, and they're not going to let outside developments affect it negatively. And also, I think that if the war ends on terms that are relatively favorable for Russia, so if the war ends and Russia remains in control of approximately 20% of Ukraine, and Ukraine is not allowed to join NATO, and it looks like Russia might be able to sort of regroup and have an opportunity to resume aggression a few years down the road. If the outcome is something like that,